Welcome to Stagecoach, where you'll find the best Western books on the market and the men and women who write them. This podcast is brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. This is your host, Ginger Winters. Join us as we continue the story of the Bone Scraper, Book 1, The Atlanta Lode, by Zachary Craig Hanson, read by Justin King.
Chapter 17, Slippery Gulch, Atlanta, Idaho, 1867. Seeing that beautiful wolf at his brother's burial site was a sign Jesse had been looking for. He remembered his first encounter with miners from the Greenback mine, who had mentioned that Atlanta was a town full of wolves, and it would be hard for Jesse to find a flock. But Jesse knew that even if he found a flock of just one sheep, it would still need protecting. And he had a feeling there were more sheep than met the eye. In the ensuing months, Jesse took Co Lamb up on his offer and worked as a bone scraper in the parlor behind his apothecary. The pay was minimal, but it afforded Jesse the chance to scope out where he could build a church for his flock, and figure out how he would fund it. After hours of meditative thinking over bones and the deceased, Jesse settled on a small plot of land near the red light district of Slippery Gulch. The area would afford Jesse the opportunity to be close to the main parts of town and potentially intercept men going to and from the whorehouses. Jesse hoped to get his church built before the harsh winters set in, and much to Co's disapproval, he sought funding from the man he had met his first night in town, Mr. Earl Cumming. Co pleaded with Jesse not to take money from the man. He was corrupt, Co said, and he employed two of the worst violators of God's law, the O'Keelys. After days of haranguing from Co, Jesse finally put an end to the conversation. He told Co there was no better way to get back at Mr. Cumming than to take his ill-gotten money and turn it over to the Lord. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous, he said. Proverbs 13:22. Like many men of God, Jesse had a collection of holy words like this locked away for use whenever an argument wasn't going in his favor. This was despite the fact that he knew Co was right. He felt in his soul that taking Mr. Cumming's money was a mistake, but he also knew that it may well be his only option if he wanted to open his church before the long 7 months of winter set in, which were approaching quickly. So, a month after his arrival, Jesse walked into the Atlanta hotel to talk with Mr. Cumming, to see if he was still of a philanthropic mindset. Once again pulling out his ear trumpet, Mr. Cumming openly berated Jesse for becoming too close with the coolies. He insisted Jesse should have taken a job in one of his mines instead of scraping over a Chinaman's bones. But after his initial lambasting was over, he looked over the stoic Jesse for what felt like an eternity before relenting and offering to fund his church. After rattling off the unbalanced terms, Mr. Cummings instructed one of the O'Keely brothers to fetch a wad of cash from a safe somewhere in the back of the building. As Jesse took the money, he felt the sense of pride, but the pride was tangled up with guilt, seared to his soul like a brand on a steer. He knew he was fulfilling an old promise to God, which brought him joy, but he simultaneously had to tamp down his lament desire for revenge as he touched the hand of his brother's killer. Jesse's relationship with Co had blossomed in the few months he had been working with him, which allowed Jesse unfettered access to the Chinese diaspora to help him build his church. Paying white man's wages to the local Asian populace also increased the work output of the men under his employ. So much so that a month after breaking ground in October of 1867, the nimble Asian woodworkers had helped erect the walls of the church and had begun tacking the roof together. The irony of the venture was that the building itself took on as many Asian characteristics of the workers who helped to construct it, including a steeply pitched roof. The church was a wood-framed 2-story building with a lower level reserved for the congregation and worship. The upstairs consisted of a lot where Jesse would sleep, study, and witness to people looking for a new path. With only weeks left to finish the project, Jesse felt confident in the prospect of conducting the first service well before winter would fully set in. While his workers were busy on the outside of the building, Jesse stayed inside to build out the 4 rows of pews that sat before his slightly raised pulpit. As he toiled away with a small lathe on an early Tuesday morning, Miss Flora James stopped by for a visit, which was becoming a much more frequent occurrence as Jesse's time in Atlanta progressed.
"Wow,
Flora said.
This place is really coming together.
Knowing who the voice belonged to, Jesse felt a smile creep across his face as he looked up to greet her. Yes, ma'am, he said. I reckon it is. I actually think I might be able to host a service here in the next week or so. Flora lifted her long dress and settled into the one completed pew, adjacent to the one Jesse was actively hammering a nail into.
You know, these things ain't all that comfy, she said.
The Lord doesn't want you sitting for too long, nor does he want you falling asleep at one of my sermons, Jesse deadpanned.
I guess you got a point. You ain't exactly the most enthralling one to talk to,
Flora said with a wink. Jesse didn't let on, but Flora's presence brought him joy and guilt at the same time. Ever since his wife and child had passed away 15 years prior, he had only known hard times, war, and loss. Feeling joy and an attraction to another woman was a struggle that he had not been expecting in this new city, but it brought him comfort. Avoiding the candor of Flora's comment, Jesse distracted himself by continuing to work on the pew. Perhaps out of respect to the quiet and reserved nature of the man, Flora got up from her resting spot and went to pick up a broom that lay in the corner of the worship hall, near the yet-to-be-built doorframe. Without being asked, she diligently began sweeping away the dirt on the floor that had been accumulating from the myriad workers who were in and out of the room on a near-constant basis. As Jesse looked up at her from his pew, the two made eye contact with reserved but knowing smiles. Impossible to conceal. Smiles that filled Jesse with hope, love, and a touch of contrition. Chapter 18. Florence, South Carolina, 1853. Ines Thalmuller was a beautiful 19-year-old of Germanic descent. Her parents had emigrated to the States when she was just 8 years old, and she found the rural nature of the city that settled in Florence to be equal parts enthralling and horrifying. Her father had found work on the newly constructed railroads that were built to haul off loads of cotton and tobacco leaves to the wealthier regions of the Northeast, and eventually worked his family into the aristocratic tiers of the local society. Ines, however, was a playful youth, the type of child who made friends with anyone she met, including the colored children she regularly crossed paths with near the cotton and tobacco fields in the vicinity of their homestead. She constantly found herself at odds with her father for fraternizing with these youths, yet as a young girl she could never understand why. Her penchant for pushing boundaries and getting into trouble followed her throughout her childhood, and was a perpetual point in contention between her and her father. She would break the rules, ride horses, wear her brother's pants, and defy the status quo of the southern debutantes she was forced to interact with at her parents' behest. By the time Ines was 18, she had a long queue of suitors lining up to vie for her hand in marriage, men ranging in age from a few years to a few decades older, but none that seemed to catch or maintain her errant attention. As her father and mother's patience wore thinner and thinner at her constant rejection of men within their social circle, Ines sought refuge by taking long rides to the river on her horse to unwind and be with her own thoughts. One summer day as humid as any other, she sat near her horse in the shade of a large oak tree overlooking the running water of the river. Just as she began to doze off, she was startled awake by the sound of boys splashing and playing in the distance. It was in that moment that she caught the first glimpse of her future husband and soulmate, Jesse Waite. Jesse had made his way to the river with two of his younger brothers. Stripping down to avoid the heat, the boys dove headfirst into the river, where they commenced splashing, wrestling, and taunting one another in a playful fashion. To Ines, the oldest boy was mesmerizing. Unlike the buttoned-up suitors who had propositioned her, Jesse was fit, handsome, and had a carefree aura about him. His smile, even from across the water, was infectious, and she could sense his paternal nature as she watched him coach and encourage his younger brothers. She couldn't articulate it at that moment, but she knew that the man swimming in front of her was the man she had been praying to meet, and she wasn't about to lose the opportunity to put an end to the madness her parents were subjecting her to. Hopping up from her hiding spot and onto her horse, she navigated to the river and hollered out to the boys, catching them all off guard. Dumbfounded, all three boys stopped in the waist-deep water and looked up at what was clearly the most stunning creature any of them had ever seen. Ines intently asked for their names and enacted a plan to draw Jesse to her side of the bank by feigning issues with her horse. Without hesitation, Jesse made the long swim over to help Ines. and before his feet hit the sandy shore of the opposite bank, he was smitten. The chemistry between the two was immediate. They both knew within short order that they were two souls meant to be together. Yet, despite the instant electricity, there was an inevitable element of Romeo and Juliet to be played out between them. For despite the budding love between the two 18-year-olds, Enos's family had built up their wealth through hard work and determination, while Jesse came from a poor white family who owned neither land nor slaves, the type who had no business intermingling with the higher society folks from town. Although Jesse had come from nothing, he had joy. After his father's passing when he was 15, his mother focused on raising boys who could provide their own food and live on faith. Jesse and his brothers became proficient hunters and studied the Bible with gusto. His entire family felt blessed, thanks to their mother's coaching, even though they had no earthly possessions outside of a few farm animals. None of this seemed to bother Enos, as she had found love in the handsome, caring, and capable Jesse Waite. As their love blossomed, so did troubles within the wider society and with Enos's family. Jesse, who had been isolated from that world, felt the first ripples in his worldview as the supposed elite levied judgments upon him left and right, with zero effort to get to know the young man for who he truly was. Throughout it all, Enos remained steadfast in her love, which only emboldened Jesse's resolve to provide for her the best way he knew how. Within a year of meeting, the couple found themselves eloped, expecting and living together in the Waite family shack. Times were tough, but their home was filled with joy. Jesse was ecstatic as he watched his wife's belly grow, and the excitement of having a daughter or son was infectious. On occasion, the couple would saddle up their horses and ride into town to visit Enos's parents, who never approved of the arrangements their daughter had chosen. Time, however, did what it does best and began to heal the wounds of distrust and sadness that had consumed Enos's parents. And as the pregnancy progressed, they succumbed to the pull of excitement around being grandparents to the child of their only daughter. It was on one of those trips into town on a cool fall Sunday in South Carolina that the unthinkable happened, an event that would catapult Jesse into a series of dramatic events that would eventually leave him with nothing but his faith in God. Riding side by side, the couple engaged in conversation about what their life would be like once their child arrived in roughly 3 months. With Enos's belly beginning to show and the kicks of their child becoming more frequent, they both knew this horseback trip may be one of their last before their baby arrived. They relished in the moment, and Jesse shared some Bible verses to punctuate the significance of this time. As the two exchanged smiles, stories, and loving glances, Enos's horse stepped near what appeared to be a stick laying in the trail. Suddenly, however, the budding Waite family was catapulted into shock as a copperhead snake struck out at the front hoof of Enos's horse, evoking an unwieldy and erratic reaction. Enos, who was an excellent horsewoman, tried to regain control, but was promptly bucked from her horse, who stood 10 hands tall. The weight of her belly threw her body through the air in an unnatural manner, throwing her feet above her head. Jesse caught sight of his wife flying through the air before landing violently on the ground. The back of her head cracked against a rock, and her petite and lifeless body crashed abruptly to the ground. Jesse's world moved in slow motion. He dismounted his horse and scrambled to his wife's side. Blood pooled at the base of her skull, and her face showed no sign of life or the joy it had held mere seconds ago. Frozen in shock, Jesse held her head in his hands and called out her name in a manic and repetitive wail, begging for her to wake up but getting no response. Though it felt like hours to Jesse, within seconds, he felt the tiny kicks of their unborn child from within his wife's womb, and at that moment, he made the hardest decision of his life: to leave his wife's side. His beloved Enos, who had just been shaken from earth like a flea. He rode the remaining 2 miles into town to retrieve medical help, as he knew it may be the only hope of saving the child who was now trapped in the abandoned body of his dear departed wife. Despite his adeptness and speed getting into town, too much time had passed by the time Jesse returned with the town doctor. Enos was dead, and her womb was slowly transformed into a comforting tomb for their child. The two passed away together on that trailside that separated the two worlds they straddled. As he dug the grave for his 2 most beloved possessions, Jesse's entire being was drained of the radiance that had first attracted Enos to him. Through his tears, he believed he would never again feel the kind of love he shared with his wife on his earthly journey, however long that journey may last. Chapter 19. Atlanta Chapel, November 1867. After a month of hard work erecting the bare essentials for his small church, Jesse was ready to open the doors of his faith center to the reeling and desperate people of Atlanta. His final touch before his first sermon on the second Sunday of November saw his Chinese crew hoisting an enormous cross over the pulpit before attaching it to the north-facing wall with oversized nails. Jesse was excited, proud, and nervous to begin fulfilling the promise to God that he had made so long ago. And through frustration and thoughts of revenge lingered in the recesses of his brain, he suppressed these thoughts and covered them with biblical teachings of forgiveness, which is exactly what he would be preaching about during his first sermon. As the third Sunday of the month approached, Jesse's frequent visitor and confidant, Flora James, began to spread the word around town about the opening of his church. This didn't bother Jesse in the least, for although he wanted to be a vessel for God's teaching and had figured out a way to build a venue for that, he was by no means a vocal participant in the community. In fact, shortly after his arrival, the normally aggressive locals had written Jesse off as, at best, a meek and mild-mannered man of God who posed no threat, or at worst, a Chinese sympathizer who didn't deserve the respect of his fellow white brethren. Either way, Jesse was a ghost in the town, and if it weren't for Flora's marketing and interest in Jesse, there would have been zero congregation for his first sermon. The morning of Jesse's first sermon, he arose early to start a fire in the small wood stove, to begin warming the 8-pew room as the season's first snow began to fall outside. As he walked around the room, running his hands along the back of each pew, he began to pray aloud while occasionally looking up at the cross looming over him. Lord, thank you. Thank you for seeing me through to this point. I promise to serve you, to serve this community, and to do what is best for these souls, he prayed. My flock is unique. I know it will be filled with wolves, and I pray for the strength to get through to them, to know them, and to bring them closer to you through your words and my actions. As he put his stamp on that prayer, he rehearsed the words he would say to whomever showed up, and then sat silently at his pulpit until the door creaked open just an hour later at 8. The first face he saw was that of his new love interest, the woman proving that his long-buried, jovial personality could still be reached, Flora James. Behind her, she had an overwhelming number of citizens from the community who were pining for the teachings of God, and no doubt looking for blessings in a town that seemed to be devoid of such things. Mostly women and children, Jesse welcomed them all before their husbands and other curious miners began to file in, and before long, there was only room left for standing. Taken aback, Jesse scanned the room and saw many familiar faces. The O'Keeley brothers leaned against the back wall. The owners of the Lenora and Greenback mines were seated with their wives, and the hobbling Mr. Cummings even made it in to check on his pious investment. Scattered amongst them were the other drunks, addicts, and rabble-rousers, giving the room a dichotomous feel, and an actual stink that mixed with the dry heat from the stove and massive bodies. In the dark corners of his brain, Jesse couldn't help but think of the irony. The most common proprietors of violence, hate, and sin in this town were all lining the pews of his chapel. But he knew it was exactly what God would want, and that brought him enough peace to rattle off his first and long-winded sermon of forgiveness and the power that it holds. As the sermon wrapped up and Jesse led the congregation in prayer and a final hymn, he felt serenity and a sense of wholeness that he hadn't felt in the last 15 years of loss, violence, and sadness. With that joy, he shared a smile and a glance with his front row attendee, Flora. A glance that did not go unnoticed by his new and yet to be repentant congregation. Chapter 20. Atlanta, Idaho, December of 1867. The streets were lined with a fresh layer of snow as the first week of December approached. Since the opening of the church, Jesse preached every Sunday, and his sermons had so far covered forgiveness, loving one another, and treating your neighbor with respect. The reception seemed warm, and Jesse's pride swelled every Sunday when the congregation was left to ponder the Lord's teachings. And after each sermon, Flora James lingered, still seated in her regular front row pew. As they sat together and talked, Jesse learned about her past, how she grew up in the antebellum South outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and how as a child, like his late wife Enos, she would play with the Negro children of her Marshland home until their parents would catch and scold her. She regaled Jesse with stories of the bone-rattling intensity of a hurricane, the frequent run-ins with alligators, and the stifling humidity that would lead to so many sleepless nights dreaming of clean mountain air. When Flora was just 15, her parents married her off to a suave sugarcane farmer near the town of Geismar, which was halfway between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. The relationship quickly turned abusive, and in short order, she was pregnant with the man's child. Between the hitting, his drinking, and the verbal berating, Flora confided in Jesse that she thought about suicide many times. Yet the thought of leaving her young daughter Rose with her terrible husband kept that primal escape hatch closed. She would stand up and pray for a way out, and one day it came. As the news slowly trickled in from the far eastern shores of Charleston and the bells of war began to ring in 1861, her slave-owning husband was overtaken by a secessionary pride that saw him join up with others in a local militia. Soon he was off to fight against the Northern aggression, which saw him gone for months, until one day Flora's freedom was sealed by way of a letter confirming the death of her husband on some Virginian battlefield. At 18 years of age, with a 3-year-old daughter in tow, Flora set her sights on that clean mountain air she had never had the earthly pleasure to breathe in. She packed up her things, and with a dignified amount of courage, she made her way to Dallas to buy her way onto the budding Oregon Trail. As she told this to Jesse, he could see the tears welling in her eyes as she began to describe that long and desolate journey. Along the route, there was so much death and fear among the 50-person train of immigrants and loners. Death came from all angles: snake bites, lightning, horses, bandits, Indians, and dysentery, the latter of which took the life of her young daughter on a dusty plain in the land of the Comanches. The man who helped her bury her gaunt and hungry child was a man by the name of Robert Tawney, a cattle rustler from North Texas who had avoided the war and was hell-bent on finding gold in the Idaho Territories. He was kind, and Flora was lonesome and distraught. She found his company a necessity to get to her destination. In a small ceremony, she and Robert tied the knot, and eventually survived their journey to Rocky Bar before catching wind of the rush in Atlanta. Seeing limited success in the placer mining ventures he was chasing in Atlanta, Robert took to drinking and gambling, and eventually sought contract work from the town butcher to go and hunt game animals during the winter. Then, just over a year ago, he had set out on a late November day to get elk for the butcher, but was never to be heard from again, leaving Flora to fend for herself once again, and to fight off the frequent advances from every miner in town. The deep and slow connection growing between Jesse and Flora stirred their giving nature, and prompted them both to do sincere community outreach. The church Jesse built was there to serve its purpose as a medium for teaching God's Word, but not everyone was welcome on the Sunday sermons. Though not posted, it was understood that only the white population was invited to revel in God's glory. The only black couple who ran the town's laundry, the Templetons, were left out, as were the hundreds of Taoist Chinese and a handful of other races. So, to honor those truly downtrodden, Jesse and Flora decided to open the doors of their church on Wednesday nights to all of those who had nowhere to worship. Jesse would preach some words, but ultimately left it up to the attendees to fellowship and pray to whatever God they saw fit. To Jesse and Flora, it was about providing them a place of worship to grow the seeds of trust in the community, a novel and dangerous idea. As the last Wednesday of November came, there were scant few attendees to the open service. The Templetons showed up, as did Coe and his family. Then a few of the Chinese laborers who helped build the church eventually sauntered in, but were unsure of how to act in a Christian establishment. Through the language barriers and awkward singing, the night ended with no big revelations, just muted thank yous and Jesse and Flora's hope that this act and their own relationship would grow into something more. Yet, what was truly metastasizing under the surface was the word going around town that the mild-mannered Jesse had opened up the church for the coolies and Negroes, stirring the rowdy town into a near frenzy. Although Jesse was shut off from the gossip, it eventually got back to him as he saw Jim and John O'Keely step into his sanctuary on the first Thursday of December. With nothing planned for the day, and his debt being paid down punctually, he knew their presence was not one of the neighborly kindness he had reached out the Sunday before. Jim, the one who had ended the life of Jesse's brother, casually knocked over a coat rack near the entrance as he and his brother split to walk either side of the pews toward Jesse, who was sitting near the pulpit under the large cross. As they made their way down the short walkway, they began to kick, pull, and throw anything that wasn't attached to the ground. The serenade of crashing wood, breaking glass, and thudding kicks did not have the intended effect that it was meant to on Jesse. Their goal was fear. But as Jesse sat at the pulpit, stone-faced and with a level heart rate, all Jesse could feel was an ember of rage flaring up in his soul. To keep it at bay, he rested his hand on the Bible at his side and said a silent prayer to God to keep him on his path. Recognizing that Jesse seemed unfazed, the brothers walked over to the newly tuned piano that had been gifted to the church by the town bar and flipped it on its side, making a horrible crashing sound as muffled off-key notes smashed against the floor. As the pair approached the pulpit, John began shouting and wagging a finger at Jesse.
Mr. Cummins wants you to know that this investment in this town's community, the Waite community, has certain stipulations. As ye know, this building is owned by Mr. Cumming, not you and not Good. And he doesn't want no blacks, coolies, or any other mongrel coming through these doors, he said. You don't start following that request, the payback time on your loan is going to shorten to an impossible timeline. And when you default, which you will, well, you know the penalty.
As the duo turned their backs, Jesse could sense that they hoped their message was intimidating enough to stick. Yet through the ringing in Jesse's ears, he could only manage to think about one thing as they walked away: violent retribution. A thought he could not act on, but one he could not put out of his mind at the moment. Without even a hint of a quiver in his voice, he yelled out to the O'Keefe brothers just one phrase as they exited through the heavy front door.
Peace be upon you, brothers, and may God be with you.
Chapter 21, Main Street, Atlanta, Idaho, December of 1867. The commotion that started to buzz around the Atlanta hotel slowly reverberated throughout the city. A tension filled the air, cut only by the falling snow that collected on the roofs of the downtown buildings. Outside of the main hotel establishment were onlookers trying to get a peek into the dining room, where Jesse and Eustace had first shared a meal just 6 months earlier. But on this day, behind the bar where Jesse had first laid eyes on Flora, lay her lifeless and blood-soaked body, with 3 holes in her chest, holes inflicted by the bullets of a .50 caliber smoothbore rimfire pistol, belonging to a man by the name of Tristan Alexander. A pestilence to every city he ever called home, the man had made his way to the end of the road and proved his mettle in back-breaking work deep in the mines of the surrounding Idaho hills. Gruff and lonely, he spent most of his time in wages at Slippery Gulch, bedding with the few whores brave enough to sleep with him. Eventually becoming bored of the town whores, his own ego took hold. He felt he deserved a real woman to marry and serve his every need. With a limited supply of eligible bachelorettes, he set his sights on Flora and began to frequent her place of work to make his advances. As her denials grew more and more abrupt, his ego began to break down and send the medium-built miner into a tailspin of erratic emotional outbursts. His emotional manifestations could be seen around town as several of the Slippery Gulch whores wore black and blue eyes, and the domestic animals began to avoid Tristan at all costs, or else find themselves on the receiving end of his angry boot heel. The straw that broke the camel's back for Tristan's fragile ego was, ironically, his attendance to the newly built church. Perhaps the one stable cell that remained in his dynamite-blasted, traumatized brain led him to a random clarity where he felt that getting right with the Lord may be his path to peace, and it prompted him to attend a Sunday service. Yet, when he arrived in the small sanctuary, he spent the entire service watching the woman of his dreams, Flora, as she locked eyes with the one man he could never compete with, the preacher. After 3 Sundays subjugating himself to this mental torture, he decided to pay Flora a visit at the bar to convince her that she should be with him and not some pious do-gooder. As Tristan walked into the Atlanta hotel, he did as he always had and sidled up to the bar, demanding a drink of whiskey from the visibly annoyed Flora. This time, though, Tristan seemed certain he could talk her into his arms. By the time the 3rd drink coursed its way into his bloodstream, Tristan kicked off his impassioned plea. Through a yellowed smile, he talked and slurred his way through all of his presumed positive attributes while Flora worked her way back and forth, tending to other customers, doing her best to ignore the increasingly desperate pleas from Tristan. As she walked past him with a glass of water for another customer, Tristan, in a fit of desperation, stood up on his stool and reached over the bar to grab her arm and stop her. In his feeble and foggy mind, he must have thought this act would show her his seriousness and embolden her to listen to his pitch, but instead, it forced her to drop the glass as she was carrying. As the glass crashed to the ground, Flora put both of her hands on the bar with Tristan's grip still around her left arm, and began a vicious stare down with the drunk man. Before Tristan had grabbed her arm, Fiona had been cleaning a few empty bottles from the bar, and happened upon the letter she had hidden the day Eustace and Jessie made their first appearance 6 months prior. Gripping the letter in her hand, with Tristan's filthy fingers still wrapped around her arm, she hissed, "You stupid dumb son of a bitch! What woman would ever want to be with such a rude, intolerant, and viciously ugly man? The only place you find love is between the few dollars you scratch together for a whore, and half of them leave with cruel reminders of your hate. Leave me alone, and—" As Flora spoke the words that had been growing on her heart for the past few months, Tristan's eyes began to dilate, and it was clear that a deep sense of shame had set in. Without hesitation or the slightest consideration for the patrons in the bar, or the ramifications that may follow, Tristan pulled out his Remington pistol, and in the middle of her punishing sentence, he dropped her to the ground with a single shot to the chest. The cloud of smoke that filled the backside of the bar masked her awkward crash to the ground. Her right hand instinctively clutched the letter she had been holding, as her body slumped forward from the impact of the .50 caliber round, crashing into her sternum. Not understanding what just happened, and not yet pained, she looked up to see bushy eyebrows and long bridged nose of Tristan Alexander's face appear through the clearing smoke of his gun, giving him a ghost-like sheen. As he raised his pistol once more, the pain overcame Flora, and she let out a pathetic moan as Tristan let off 2 more rounds that ended the tragic life of Flora James right there on the alcohol and dust-covered floor of the Atlanta Hotel. Lamb burst through the doors of the church in a visibly panicked state. Shaking the snow from his thin leather boots, he made a direct line toward Jessie, who was busy retuning the piano that the O'Keefe brothers had destroyed a few days prior. "Jessie, it's Flora," Co said, and his countenance and tone was all Jessie needed to infer that something terrible had happened. Dropping the piano wire onto the pew beside him, he took off at a full run with Co toward the downtown area, just a few hundred meters away. As the duo made the turn onto Main Street, the crowd that had formed outside of the Atlanta Hotel was growing. The normally reserved Jessie pushed, clawed, and forced his way to the door like a rabid dog, before being grabbed by both shoulders by the burly sheriff, Ezra Hott. "Jessie, you don't want to go in there," the sheriff said. "Flora got worked over pretty good." Wriggling away from the sheriff's grasp with more power than Ezra was expecting from the smaller man, Jessie made a beeline into the hotel to take in the scene. He couldn't see Flora anywhere at first glance, but could make out the crimson spatters of blood covering the back wall and liquor bottles. As his ears began to ring, he made his way to the bar top in the otherwise empty room. As he peered over the bar, his face contorted into a look of acidic anguish. All hope of a potential redemption at love faded away as he looked at the crumpled body of sweet Flora. His countenance shifted to one of stone, numb and detached, as he walked around the bar to take in the reality of the tragic scene. Bending over, he reached under Flora's arms and propped her up into a more dignified pose, and then sat down beside her to cradle her lifeless body in his arms. As a few silent tears streamed down his cheek, he noticed the letter she held in her bloody right hand. She remembered that she had hastily written a letter under some bottles on the first day they had met. This must have been that same letter. As he opened it, a small photo fell out, showing a radiant young Flora holding what must have been her daughter, with the following words etched onto the back. "Dearest sister, I am so sorry to hear about all your troubles as of late. I am saddened to hear of Robert's untimely disappearance, but I am glad you have found a friend, Emily, to confide in. I surely can't imagine what you must be going through with the anniversary of your daughter's death approaching this July, and I hope she can help console you. We are praying for you, and I have no doubt a great man will come soon to sweep you off your feet. We all miss you here in Baton Rouge.
although it is as hot as it has ever been. I hope to see you one day, and to once again taste your famous roux. With love, Annabelle.
Jesse felt the multitude of emotions in that moment, as he held the only other woman he had grown to love, dead in his arms. He wasn't sure who Emily was, but felt relief that Flora had a confidant in town to share her secrets with. Slipping the photo into his pocket, he laid Flora's body down on the ground, covered her with a nearby kitchen apron, and stormed back toward the front of the hotel.
Who did this?
Jesse demanded in an uncharacteristic tone.
Don't you worry, Jesse, we caught him just outside of town, said the sheriff. Old Tristan Alexander is your man. According to the witnesses, he got drunk and made some passes that Flora shot down. Then, in what they described as a rabid fit of rage, Tristan pulled out a pistol and shot her 3 times. We got him sitting in the jailhouse now, and we'll figure out what to do with him the next few days.
Sheriff Ezra Hott paused for a moment.
Say, I know it ain't great timing, but it was known you two were close, he said. She ain't got nobody else in this town. What do you want to do with the body?
Jesse exchanged a glance with Coe, who stood within earshot, and he replied with an understanding nod. Disappearing into the crowd, Coe made his way home to get his oxen and cart to come and retrieve Flora's body. The rest of that afternoon, Jesse and Coe took care to load the deceased woman into the cart and move her slowly and with reverence out of the bone scraper's burial field, where Jesse's brother lay. As Jesse's spade struck the ground, he was surprised how soft it was. The moisture from the light snow made digging easy as he burrowed out a shallow grave, right next to his brother's. As the sun began to set, Jesse planted a wooden cross at the head of Flora's grave, mirroring that of his brother's. Kneeling between the 2 soft lumps in the ground, one white with snow and the other black with turned earth, he found himself once again praying.
Lord, these tests, they are hard. I hope you'll show me the way. Give me peace, reverence, and forgiveness if that be your will, for I made a promise not to kill more men. But I feel the weight of those chains pulling me back, closer and closer to my past. Give me strength. Give my loved ones eternal rest.
At the end of his prayer, he stared off into the snow-covered pines and made eye contact with the same large wolf he had seen when he first visited his brother. It was peering back at him with a curious look that held ravenous and dangerous undertones. Jesse took this as a sign that he still had more to do in this town full of wolves, and he silently gave himself over to the sad and painful direction of the Lord's will. Chapter 22. Bone Scraping Parlor, Atlanta, Idaho, December of 1867. After laying Flora to rest, Coe had Jesse help him load 3 mostly decomposed bodies from the burial site into the back of his ox cart. This act always unnerved Jesse, but he had gotten used to it in the months that he had been working for Coe. It was a delicate act where he and Coe would try their best to keep the body intact as they transferred it from the turned earth to the ox cart. But 9 times out of 10, the body would give out at some joint and fall to the ground, busting up into many separate and distinct bones. The eeriest part for Jesse was when the bugs didn't clean up the skull well, leaving a thin skin over the facial bones and leaving a ghoulish look on the deceased's face.
I know today's been hard. Let's go back and get to work for the rest of the evening while my wife cooks dinner,
Coe said.
I know you Christians have a saying about hide your hands.
Coe whipped the reins of his oxen then, and they began to lurch slowly back toward town. As Jesse looked over his shoulder at the 2 graves, he couldn't help but wonder how this is all supposed to play out in God's broader plan. He had promised not to kill anyone after the war, but his heart was filled with malice and contempt, no matter how hard he tries to suppress it. How can I overcome and learn to love such evildoers in town who have already robbed me of so much joy in such a short time? He thought. Back at Coe's shop, they unloaded the bodies and immediately went to work doing the rote exercise of scraping bones. As Jesse sat there in silence, moldy and spongy flesh piled at his feet until his concentration was interrupted by Coe's daughter, Lynn, bringing the men some tea. Putting down his knife and bone, he thanked the joyful young girl and picked up his drink. Normally reserved around men that worked with their father, especially white men, Lynn stopped and turned around as she reached the door.
"Mr. Waite,"
she said,
"I am sorry about Miss Flora. She was a very nice woman."
As quickly as the words came out, she turned and headed back across the yard to the apothecary and their small dwelling place. Some daughter you have there, Co.
Yes, we are proud of her. She wishes to go to a big city one day. She wants to be a doctor just as I was back in China.
As their tea break came to a close, they continued with their work, consumed by a monk-like silence. But, a short time later, out of character for Jesse, he began to open up to his friend about the thoughts that enveloped his psyche. "Co, this town, it has tested me. I have known death, I have killed men, and I have made a promise to God that I would not follow that path anymore. It seems as though there is no justice for the victims of these sinners," he said. Co sat in silence. Without interruption, he listened, allowing Jesse to get his feelings off his chest. Day in and day out, the mine bosses funded by Mr. Cumming abuse their workers. The workers abuse the whores take advantage of the men. Innocent men and women are caught in the middle of this violent cycle, Jesse continued. Though I have seen a change in a few men since the church opened, it seems as though the word of God alone can't penetrate the leathered minds of these heathens.
People feel they can get away with things here,
Go said.
For instance, old Ezra Hutt will not keep that Tristan Alexander locked up long. People know he is violent, but he has many friends in the mining community. If they don't let him off, then Ezra will have an insurrection on his hands.
Understanding Ko's response but feeling too irritated to respond, Jesse went back to scraping the bones and began to stew on what God's plan for him in this town was really meant to be. Chapter 23, Atlanta Chapel, December of 1867. It had been a week since Ko and Jesse had laid Flora down to rest. In that time, Jesse had focused on cleaning up the mess the O'Keelys had made of his small sanctuary. Once again, he attempted to retune the shattered piano. The effort distracted Jesse for a short burst of time, but he found himself lamenting the fact that until he paid his debt to Mr. Cumming, he would not be able to serve all the folks in the community the way he intended. During his choring, Jesse continued to pray to God about what all of his suffering meant, and how best to continue serving this small town. He was frustrated at the lack of clarity, but as the end of December drew closer, he shifted his focus towards celebrating the birth of Jesus. As Jesse left his church on the Monday before Christmas, he felt a sense of calm. Through all of his praying and pleading with God for clarity, he found himself thankful for a chance to distract himself by preparing for his special Wednesday service on Christmas Day. As he began to walk the streets of town, his path took him along the outskirts of Slippery Gulch. His trek took him past the old Estradas, which were quickly filling up with snow before connecting with the west side of Main Street. With just 2 days to go until Christmas, the town was buzzing. It seemed as though all of the neighborly spirit that had been so hard to come by was pouring out of even the most contemptible of people. Even the non-white store owners like the Lambs and the Templetons seemed to have a pass for decorating their storefronts with tinsel and other homemade decorations. This connectivity lifted Jesse's low spirits for a few blocks, until he passed the one-room jailhouse on the right side of the road. The building appeared barren and unlit. Jesse sprinted over to the door and peered inside, hoping to see the man who had killed his second chance at love. But the jailhouse was empty. No Ezra Hutt, and more importantly, no sign of Tristan Alexander. Rushing diagonally across the street to Co's apothecary, Jesse stormed in to find Lynn decorating the shelves of her father's store. "Lynn, where's your dad?"
"He's back in the bone-scraping parlor,"
Lynn answered.
"Is everything okay?"
Without answering, Jesse stormed through the living quarters, out the back door, and across the snow-covered yard up to the bone parlor. "Co, did you know about this? Where's the sheriff? Where's Tristan? Please tell me they took him out to be hanged." Drawing in a breath and exhaling before he spoke, Co looked his friend in the eyes and explained what had happened.
Jesse, it looks like Mr. Cumming greased the wheels with the sheriff," he said. "For a fee, he bought Tristan's freedom. Why? I do not know, but I believe it is to keep the miners on his side.
Immediately deflated of any Christmas spirit, Jesse headed back to his loft above the church to pray. Sitting at his bedside weeping, he allowed the emotion of the prior 15 years to flood through him, and he wailed without regard to who might hear him. His whole adult life after losing Enos and their child was punctuated by violence, sorrow, and the unclear direction he was following from God. But as the accrual of all these events chipped away at the armor of a stoic and faithful man, Jesse received a sign. Looking down from his loft through soggy eyes, he saw that his Bible, which had been sitting on the pew by the piano, had fallen to the floor. Having been indoctrinated as a child to treat the holy book with reverence, his instincts kicked in, and he climbed down to go and pick it up. When he got to the pew and picked up his most prized earthly possession, he was compelled to read the passage exposed on the open fragile pages. "Vengeance is mine, and retribution. In due time their foot will slip, for the day of their calamity is near, and the impending things are hastening upon them." Deuteronomy 32:35. Climbing back into his loft, he began to focus on these words. He read them over and over again until he drifted off to sleep to the sounds of the night's drunken forays in the distance near Main Street. Chapter 24. Atlanta Chapel. Christmas Eve, 1867. Jesse woke up with his Bible on his chest. Picking it up, he immediately reread the passage from the night before and asked once again for the Lord to send him understanding as to what the passage meant. Working his way down to the sanctuary, Jesse gazed at the piano wire still sitting on the second pew nearest to the piano. Knowing that this would be his main goal to finish before tomorrow's Christmas service, he decided to get the wood-burning stove started in order to warm his work spot for the day. As Jesse began to load the second pew into the stove, he heard the heavy door at the front of the church swing open, an odd occurrence at this time of the morning. From out in the cold entered a man Jesse had only encountered a few times, but had heard a lot about from both Co and Flora. Walter Frank, the foreman of the Lenore mine, and the man who had hung the fellow he and Eustace saw when they first got to Montezuma Creek many months ago. Jesse could sense that the man was in distress. He appeared haggard and exhausted. As Jesse greeted him and welcomed him toward the altar, the stink of booze and body odor hit Jesse hard as he motioned for Walter to sit at the front pew. As Walter settled beneath the omnipresent view of the large wooden cross, Jesse placed his hands on the man's shoulder and sat down in the pew behind him. Jesse wasn't sure why the man had come to him, but soon enough, vitriol and false remorse spewed from the mouth of Walter Frank like sludge from a rusted faucet. As Walter recounted the rape and murder of Jesse's closest friend's daughter just hours before, his words pierced through the low humming in Jesse's ears and had an epiphany. All at once, his purpose was clear. Yes, Jesse had vowed to kill no more men, but his promise had been rooted in the trauma of slaughtering innocent men, good men, on the field of battle. But hearing of the unforgivable acts inflicted upon an innocent dove like Lynn made Jesse realize that the Lord had placed him in this town not to forego his skills as a killer, but to embrace them. He was to be God's vessel of retribution. As the clarity of the moment consumed him, he felt God's hand guiding him towards the piano wire to his right, and in his head he repeated the words he had read in his open Bible. "In due time their foot will slip, for the day of their calamity is near." With spiritual reassurance, Jesse acknowledged his new purpose, to cleanse the town of the cancer that had taken hold, and he slit the piano wire around Walter's neck. The struggle was brief, and Walter Frank was dead, his head craned backward, hanging on by a single vertebra. Jesse arose from the pew and went to clean his hands, watching the swirl of blood in the wash basin as it mixed with water in obscure and random patterns. He looked back at the body of Walter. If it weren't for his nearly detached head, it would have looked like he was praying. One less wolf to contend with to keep the flock safe, Jesse thought. Jesse dried his hands off on a towel and approached the altar. He opened his Bible to the last blank page and scribbled down the names of 5 men, striking a line through the first one. Walter O'Frank, Jim O'Keely, John O'Keely, Tristan Alexander, Earl Cumming, The impending things are hastening upon them.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Stagecoach, brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, the home of Western excellence, where the best of the Western authors can be found. Visit our website at dspublishingnetwork.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue with the adventures of Jesse Waite in The Bone Scraper by Zachary Craig Hanson.